Welcome, everybody. I'm Robert Aronoff, and I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the Beverly Hills Bar Association and the program chair for today's program. On behalf of the Beverly Hills Bar Association, I want to welcome you to our webinar on business appraisal and real estate valuation in 2020, application of the federal rules of evidence in a free-fall economy. As we just developed our program, we will be focusing today mostly on the valuation of assets in an uncertain economy. If you have questions, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we have time for. Let me tell you a little bit about our speakers. To tell you all of their qualifications and accomplishments would leave little time for them to speak. The materials you were sent before this, I think yesterday and just before this program, you received a link to get the materials, and you may want to follow along with those as we go. And those materials also have great detail on our speakers. Our first speaker is Leo Schultz. He's a valuation economist, an MAI real estate appraiser, and an expert witness with over 30 years of experience analyzing real property and environmental and economic damages. Mr. Schultz holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Chicago. Experts in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California refer to him as the smartest dirt appraiser they know. Mr. Schultz has been an expert witness in numerous proceedings. In the MCI bankruptcy case, he was responsible for the appraisal of all of the assets on its exit from bankruptcy proceedings. Steve Ferraro holds a PhD in finance and economics from Louisiana State University. Dr. Ferraro has over 25 years of strategic valuation and business valuation experience. His engagements include valuation of equity, of businesses, enterprise values, valuation of controlling interests, valuation of minority interests, and valuation of options. In addition to his valuation practice, Dr. Ferraro is a professor of finance at the Pepperdine Grazio School of Business. And Scott Bovis is a certified specialist in bankruptcy law by the American Board of Certification and the California State Bar. He is the founder of the Monday Night Lawyer Movie Club, unless it's on Tuesday. It's there that he first expressed his discontent with the quality of expert opinion when evaluating assets in a fast-changing and moving market. That became the genesis of the program today. And this program today would not be possible without the assistance of Daniel Edmonian, who took all of the information from our speakers and prepared the slide deck, which is in the materials that you were sent earlier today and which I referred to. And be sure to follow along with them. The speakers will refer to those slides, but they won't be able to go into them in detail. You may want to take notes or ask questions about them as they go along. Dan is a valuation economist and an entrepreneur. He has over 8 years of experience in litigation consulting, focusing on antitrust, bankruptcy, environmental valuation, and other economic damages. He's the co-founder of Virtuous Vices, LLC. Our speakers worked very hard today to prepare the detailed slide deck to which they will be referring. It contains more information than they're going to have time to tell you about. They will be moving quickly through it. As I said, you were sent with the confirmation of this program a link to get your copy of the slide deck. Please follow along and take your notes on your copy. With that, let me turn this program over to Scott Bovis, who will give you a brief introduction to our subject matter. Scott?
It is true that this started at the Monday Night Lawyer Movie Club, unless it's on Tuesday. We have our programs on bankruptcydog.com, and you can see all sorts of stuff there. But it also came from an earlier presentation of the Beverly Hills Bar Association on expert witnesses. You know, the federal rules of evidence are mighty thin in connection with this. You've got 702 that says, hey, if you're an expert by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education, that would be the stuff on the right here on slide number 3. Knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education, you can be an expert. And if you're an expert, you can give an opinion. You have to get the basis of your expert's opinion testimony under 703, and they can rely on admissible and inadmissible things in rendering that opinion. They have to disclose it in 705, and every now and then you actually have a court appointed. That's Rule 706, Federal Rule of Evidence. But most of the time, the parties have an expert. We'll hire Vallejo, or someone else will hire the other person, and they will do battle over value of something that's not actually going to be sold. Now, that's pretty funky. How does that work? Well, I'm sure you've got your 11th version of M. Winkleread, Evidentiary Foundations, and M. Winkleread, who I love, he has the Q&A for all that sort of stuff, says, after stating his or her expert qualifications, the expert's testimony follows a syllogistic structure. I don't know what that means, but I like it. The expert describes a general explanatory theory, technique, or methodology. The major premise, don't you love that, states the case-specific facts to be evaluated, the minor premise, and derives an opinion, the conclusion. Now, having said all of that, what do? We're litigators. I'm a bankruptcy litigator. We're all litigators, one kind or another. And we're looking at these weird reports, a lot of reports on dirt, a lot of reports on valuation of business enterprises, and I don't really understand them. So at the movie club over a meal and other imbibing things, not necessarily alcoholic, but just stuff, we started talking about these things. And thence we came to this program. So, Vallejo, I don't really know what you guys do.
Yes, well, we can move on to slide 4.
Vallejo, before you begin, I want to point out that there's a link in the chat version at the bottom of your screen for people to get the materials if they still haven't gotten it.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Bar Association for giving us this opportunity to make this presentation. And when we're as appraisers, when we're looking at these types of assignments, especially when there is a major shift in the market that is going to cause distress to assets, our biggest concerns are what's happening in the macro environment. And the second thing is we're going to start seeing some transactions occur, but we don't know if those transactions actually relate to the new market clearing price, or if it's just a process of price discovery, or if there is no data and we have to go back and use older data. Our big question is that old data still relevant in the current market? Those are all various questions, and we have a lot of methods to evaluate that. When we're facing those problems, when I face those problems, I always can return to the definition of market value, which we will address later. But we want to understand the relationship, the knowledge, and the motivation of the participants, of the people that transact in these assets, the terms of the transaction, and whether or not there was reasonable market exposure, and whether there's any undue influence or anything like that in the transaction. Those are the key points. And that's what brings us back to reality in a free-falling market, is to say, are we meeting the requirements of market value? Is our data reasonable and supported? And how does it fit into the macro market? And we're going to touch on each one of these points as we go through this presentation.
Slide 5. So we all know that somehow things are different, right? And one of the things that was different, that was obvious to me right away, was that somebody was going to decide if everybody's wearing masks, there are going to be more bank robberies. We actually found a quote on that on 5. But let's look at 6 for a second. We just made a list of stuff that's changed. There's a million things that have changed, that continue to change. And so I would naturally think, if I'm reading a report, that my expert has to consider these things. Maybe the old way was, this is the value, and you subtract a They call it diminution. You subtract something. Maybe you add something if you make, I don't know, respirators or whatever. There has to be some difference, some change, some something. Vallejo, talk to us about the current market in slide 7.
Well, what I want to do is I want to establish what our baseline was before the event happened. So let's go back to January of 2020. You know, we had high employment. We had all these things that were going on in the market. Things were pretty stable. There were a few things. There was a little weakness showing up in certain aspects of the market in general. A lot of questions of whether assets were overvalued or not, or because we're at very high valuations these days. And we also had this outstanding thing with the trade disputes with different countries around the world. But overall, people felt the economy was relatively strong. Then March happened. Well, the COVID happened, and in March is when, like in California, everything broke. Unemployment went way, way up, very, very fast. We had a lot of intervention by the central bank and the government. There were moratoriums on evictions. And we know the problems that we're in right now. We still do not know what's going to happen long-term for income taxes, trade disputes, or even what the solvency of the banking system will be. Things look positive, things look negative. It's still very difficult to tell, but we're now accumulating the information that will allow us to do our research. Anyway, go forward to the next slide, please.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Steve Ferraro, and I am, just by way of brief introduction again, and 25 years ago when I started doing valuation work, I learned very quickly that it's a complex process. And we rely very heavily on external markets and the information we can find there, whether it's for growth rates or expected rates of return, the cost of capital, or structural shifts. And we're in a time right now where our economy has shifted way off trend, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. And we're not quite certain where things are headed based on maybe some traditional approaches we've taken in the past, or at least we've relied on heavily. In this visual here, we have, for example, employment trends. And these curves represent the time it took to return to employment levels following recessions. And just as reference points, if you look at the purple and the green trend, those are the past 2 recessions we've had. If we look at the red line, which isn't a trend quite yet, you'll see that there's quite a difference in the starting point of these trends. Now, we may recover quickly, or it may take quite a while for us to recover. And that's a decision that we have to make as appraisers when we're trying to model things, is what will this look like going forward? Next slide, please. Another interesting artifact in the market right now is consumer confidence, because we're a very consumer-driven economy here in the US. Consumer confidence and the propensity to spend is incredibly important to value. And you can see here that consumer confidence has fallen off a cliff. Now, to give you a little bit broader perspective here, back in 2008, again in 2011, this index actually fell to 55. So it's not quite as bad as it was during the last real estate blow-up that we had, but it's still a meaningful shift, and time to recovery is still highly uncertain. Next slide.
As we go into delve into the market, we can see that the mortgage-backed security market has the largest delinquency rate ever recorded currently. And if we go to the next chart, it shows the significance of this impact over the last few months. This is phenomenal. It's possible that some of these properties are going to come in back and pay their delinquent rent and mortgages and so forth. But a lot of this is being driven by the tenants of these commercial properties. The tenants have restaurants, hotels. A lot of people are having difficulty making their mortgage payments, their rent payments, and their mortgage payments. If we go on, and banks are noticing this, they're taking a lot of consideration. Wells Fargo, for example, announced that they're going to limit car loans to independent car dealerships. I was speaking with a chief appraiser with a bank here in Southern California, and he told me that their commercial lending division is virtually shut down right now, that they're not making any new loans until they figure out what's going on. And, and one thing I would like to point out is that the Fed does not appear to be buying real estate-backed mortgages right now. They're buying primarily corporate debt as part of this current workout that they're orchestrating. Next slide, please.
Yeah, another thing the Fed has done is it's lowered interest rates to historical lows again. And this graphic just shows us yield curves, which are essentially the basis for our cost of capital calculations, or this is where we go to get expected returns from investors. And you can see in Japan and in Europe, the yield curve is actually negative going out 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And these negative rates can have a profound impact on valuation and the way we look at value and risk and return. Slide 15, please. So another important part of the market that right now is unusual for us is how the equity markets are performing. We use equity markets to go and get relative risk measures and expected returns, but over the last several months, as the market has skyrocketed higher, it's a little bit of a bifurcation because the 5 FANG stocks, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Google, have been outpacing the market dramatically, which means our traditional measures now are getting fragmented, our traditional risk measures, because the relative risk is now shifting more toward internet and tech stocks versus just a broad portfolio of equities in the US markets. Next slide, please. Another important shift in our markets is the frequency and relativity, or relative frequency rather, with which companies have been buying back their own stocks. Now, this has an effect to help hold up stock prices. And prior to our collapse, many companies were actively buying back stocks, but that's not the case now. And who knows when that will happen again or start reoccurring again with the same frequency. But it has important implications for our measures of risk and expected return.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Dan. We knew that we were going to have the technology thumper. Okay, this is the when I go out and I do a program live and in person, we always have paper as well, right? So you can follow along. This slide is in here because I insisted we have a slide that uses the words euphoria, denial, panic, and capitulation in it. It actually shows that the market, the business cycle kind of follows the market. It's not exactly one for one. There's a little bit of lag time. That's what these guys told me. And I know, since they're my experts, that I have to rely on it. Next slide.
However, that slide shows nice stylistic curves for our business cycles, but that's not how they work in reality. So you can see by this headline that there is some concern that the US rates will fall into negative territory like we have in Japan and in Europe, which is a signal that our economies are really not healthy. They're not functioning the way they typically do. And again, that's just a major concern and an issue we have to wrestle with as appraisers. We have to figure out how to get it right in this uncertain economy. Next slide.
Hey, Steve, before we move on, could you just address negative interest rates and just give everyone a description of what you consider a negative interest rate to be?
Well, a negative interest rate is a situation where the cost of capital has fallen to essentially zero. It's more important for savers because banks now are not encouraging savings, but the cost of capital for corporations is at historic lows. And we can tie this into the buybacks a little bit, because if companies can go out and borrow for next to nothing, and they can take the proceeds and use what they need for investment, they'll take the extra and buy back shares, and that helps to prop up the market. But again, those valuations that we see in the market might be a little bit distorted because of the Fed's policies today.
One thing we do hear from negative interest rates is that you're getting paid to borrow money, But isn't that just another way of saying that we're overcapitalized in the market? We have too much physical capital?
We do. Yeah, we have too much liquidity in the markets right now. That also results in driving up prices.
Okay, good. Thanks.
The next slide is my favorite slide in the whole bank. By the way, you notice my slides are usually pretty boring. These slides have lots of color and things. Thank you, Dan and Steve and Vallejo. But bankruptcies are up. They're not quite the tidal wave we've told is going to come yet, but business bankruptcies are coming in. And so a part of the valuation in the bankruptcy court is you've got to value stuff for motion for relief from the automatic stay. You have to value stuff in connection with determining whether a plan is feasible. You got to look at your liquidation and compare Chapter 7 to Chapter 11. There's a lot of battles here in connection with that and understanding what these folks have to say. Next slide.
On this slide, the thing I'd like to really draw people's attention to is the upper left-hand corner. We have a we have a chart showing that only 54% of the tenants are paying rent. In malls, that number drops down to about 25% of the tenants are actually paying their rent. And this is data that's coming straight from CoStar. This is, first of all, as a valuation expert, I look at this and it just shows me the amount of distress that's potential in the market. The second thing I'm thinking of is that if the property owners are only getting 25% of their income, it's really hard to make their debt service. And that also just implies the instability of the market.
Slide 21, which is Steve's slide, but let me introduce it by saying this. So here I am, I'm in court, and I need to get a report of some kind, a value on a piece of dirt or developed property or a business interest. And so I turn it over to you guys and you come up with a report that says, yes, here's the fair market value of my equity interest, or here's the market value of the dirt. What does that mean, Steve?
Well, when as appraisers, we have to figure out what value is based on the definitions that are provided by our profession. And frankly, there are multiple valuations. They all kind of sound alike when you read through the definitions, but we're looking for a value that would occur at arm's length transactions. And interestingly enough, in bankruptcy court, there isn't a specified value of definition. So we bring those with us through our appraisal process and in our reports. Next slide.
Diminution in value. Go
Diminution
Vallejo.
in value. We have two basic values that we're looking at, the impaired value or the unimpaired value. And in litigation, that's what we really look at because we're trying to measure damages. In bankruptcy, oftentimes we're just interested in what the value is, but the methods for estimating them are the same. And basically, we're trying to say something bad happened, how did it affect value? So you look at a baseline condition and you compare it to once you control for all the various risk factors and how that would affect the market and the reasonableness of that, then you can deduct those two and determine the diminution in value. Now,
So hold on, Vallejo. Okay, before you go to slide 20, we're on 22 at the moment. Are you telling me that you take your traditional way of coming up with a value, and that's $1? And if it's an industry that's worse off because of the free fall economy, you subtract something? Is that what you're doing?
yes. It could be the rent loss, it could be an increase in operating cost, it could be all sorts of other things. And we have methods to make that a present value calculation and do the deduction of that particular amount. It could also be a regulatory event or something else or increase in risk. Okay, next slide, please. When I'm appraising a property, I look at it from two different perspectives. One, I look at what are the issues that are being faced. Is there increased cost? Is there a change in use? And what's happening to the risk? And then we have a timeline consideration. Is this in the stable pre-event condition, or what does it take to get us back to stability or the repair process in the middle of the part? And then the third thing is, after things have we've done all we can, how long and how much risk are we facing that we're going to have additional problems going forward. The chart on the following page, the graph, this shows this effect. And what we're doing is we're essentially measuring and quantifying the delta or the difference between the dotted line and the solid step function that you see here in this example.
So
And-
when we talked about this and we're preparing this, I said, you can't give this to a judge, because you give the judge one of these weird kind of step charts. They go, what? Just give me a dollar amount and tell me it's, I started $1 and I subtracted 5 cents for this and I added 2 cents for that. So does your report show this, or does your report come out in plain English?
Well, our report shows this, and it comes out in plain English also. But this is also a roadmap for where we're going to be, where we're going, and we have to determine what stage we're in, and what the risks are, and what the costs are, and what the use impacts are, and we have certain tools for evaluating those items, and that just leads to the credibility and the defensibility of our analysis.
So this is really a cross-examination checklist. Did
Right.
the other side go through the same steps that you're going through?
Exactly. And this just is a visual, allows people to conceptualize it over time as a timeline. If we can go to the next slide, this is essentially the same chart, but it shows that we hear a lot these days about a V shape, a U shape, or a W, which is just 2 U's, or an L shape. And big thing is the length of the term, the greater the uncertainty, the longer the greater the damages that are going to be to either a business or a property. And this is what, especially in a downturn where there isn't physical changes to the assets, this usually happens more on a financial front, and it can take, for example, the last recession took many, many years for the market to return. If we go to the next slide.
This slide, by the way, for those people who have been slowly not up, stop. This is great. This is exactly describes our problem right now. It's the stuff between J07 and J08, which I think is January 07, 08. Go Vallejo.
So what we have here, you'll see that as the market was peaking and the market was breaking down, there was a lot of dispersion, there was a lot of uncertainty. Then the market died. I mean, you can actually see the date where it looks like there's for 6 months in this really this is a heritage subdivision in Fontana. It's very homogeneous. And this subdivision, all market activity stopped for a few months. And if you go to, say, maybe mid-2008, you'll see there were a few properties that sold at high values, but those were most likely sales that were where they were going through the price discovery process and didn't know whether the market had really fallen or how far it had fallen, so on and so forth. That those comps wouldn't be very helpful in doing an evaluation of asset values in that marketplace.
So what this tells you is that your comps might be okay to the left in that market on any given year, and to the right once you have stability, but in between you're going to have comps that go low and high, and you don't really know how much reliability you can have with respect to those. Is that what this tells you?
Yes. And the other thing is that we can use this from past recessions. It's always best to be in the current period, but we can say here we're looking at 7 years of data from the peak to the last part of our data. This market took 10 years before it came back to the original price levels.
Yeah, we bankruptcy lawyers really liked that recession, but that's just a, sad thing. People who make bullets enjoy, the bullets get used. All right, so go ahead.
But this is a tool for us to estimate the length of time that an asset or the class of assets can be impaired for discounted cash flows or our other ways that we account for the time value of money and the lost rents or lost income, lost profitability, and so forth.
Right. Now, so this told me, okay, that's how the dirt guys do it, right? But Steve, he values things that are less tangible. You don't necessarily go out and knock on the wall and have it there. And he uses this weird thing that he just blew me away with called the triangulation of value. Go ahead, Steve, slide 27.
All right, thank you. Yeah, as we just discussed, there are times where we have market disruptions and the data becomes less usable and versus normal places or normal places in the cycle. But we also have different approaches we can take to value things. And the three common approaches are an income approach where we're forecasting future cash flows. There's a market approach where we compare, for example, if I'm valuing a private company, I'll go find publicly traded comps or peers or guideline companies. And then there's also something called an asset-based approach where we adjust the balance sheet to market values. Now, Vallejo, I know real estate appraisers have something similar to the asset-based approach called the cost approach. And what do you do there?
Well, in the cost approach, we estimate the value of the land, and then we come up with the value of the improvements using either engineering cost, or we use cost manuals, nationally published cost manuals that we are experts in using and make adjustments to accordingly. And that's primarily what we use. Then we also go out into the market and come up with estimates of entrepreneurial incentives and all of the soft costs that go into putting an asset in place. And then depreciate it.
So at this point, Vallejo draws something on a napkin at the meeting of the Monday Night Lawyer Movie Club, unless it's on Tuesday, and that's slide 28. Okay.
And this is just a supply-demand curve with the equilibrium, and this is the way that I personally think of the market when I'm looking at these assets. And one implies the cost approach, one implies the sales approach, and one applies the income approach. And I don't want to spend any time on this, but I just want you to know that we are applied economists and we think and talk like economists, but we try to put it into the words and that are meaningful for buyers and owners of assets.
So you did. It's slide 29 after I forced you to, okay? You actually wrote down some words. Go ahead.
Okay, and my words are cost, income, and sales comparison. And we have the simpler, the more traditional methods where we use the cost manuals, or we just do direct capitalization of the income and come up with capitalization rates. And that works for assets that are going to be owned in perpetuity, or that we're expected to generate income in perpetuity, such as real estate. Businesses may only have a 6 or 7 year life cycle or 10-year life cycle, so direct capitalization may not be appropriate in those situations. And the sales comparison approach, we pick a selection of comps, the way that Steve was talking about a couple minutes ago, and then we make adjustments and comparisons to those. Now, as technology has advanced, big data has advanced, we now oftentimes rely on regressions in our sales comparison approach because we can look at 1,000 or 1,500 sales at one time. We also use the discounted cash flow models a lot more. However, in court situations, we still like to do direct capitalization on real estate because it's easier for judges and juries to comprehend. Well, judges have a bias against discounted cash flows because in the real estate, they're more apt for manipulation. And if you get a report with a discounted cash flow, you want to go through that cash flow model very, very carefully.
Okay, so after all of our back and forth, you came up with the magic slide 30, and Steve and Vallejo both have something to say about that. I love this slide. It's colorful. It shows that they use different methods, and they kind of have there's a value somewhere in this yellow zone, right? Vallejo.
Yes. I mean, it's just a visual representation of the expectations. And when we're analyzing income, we use our financial analytical skills. Looking at cost, that's more the accounting type skills. And then the sales comparison is the regression statistically minded methods of economists. And we would expect that all three values should be somewhat similar, and we would in our final valuation and in our reconciliation, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the program. But this is just a precursor and a frame set for what we're looking at going forward.
I'd love to have this as my closing demonstrative, right? And I could put a little dot where the other person, has their reports, and I put dots where you are, and I show you're right in the middle of these little boxes. And, this is something a judge would love. Steve, you have a slightly different way of saying it starting on slide 31, right?
Well, we do, but the idea is the same. Yeah, we talk about triangulation of value and those three main approaches we take. So the first approach is an income approach. And as Vallejo said, this is based on discounting cash flows. So in the business world, this is a very important approach. Now, Vallejo mentioned that this can be subject to manipulation, and there are other potential problems with these models. And this is why we have the three different approaches to use together to try to come up with a reasonable value. So in the DCF model, we're just forecasting cash flows, we're forecasting risk, the cost of capital, and we're coming up with a present value calculation. Next slide, please. Now, this visual is there to help you understand how we think about our problems, how we frame our problems as appraisers. So our DCF model, that top line, just represents a DCF model where you can only forecast one possible future at a time. And that's not realistic. So appraisers may take a next step and add a base case with an optimistic case and a pessimistic case, which gives us a value range, and then they may enhance it even further with simulations. But there's sometimes where these models aren't sufficient, and those are times when we have high uncertainty. So for example, in our current economy, we have high uncertainty. In bankruptcy cases, we have high uncertainty. And in those situations, sometimes we go to option pricing models or real options analysis to do the valuation work. Next slide. Now, the second approach is our market approach. And again, here we're looking at peer companies or guideline companies to go to the market and see how the market is pricing things. And we'll use this in conjunction with the DCF models to create a range of values and try to understand what's important in the market at certain points in time and what isn't. But part of this process that you go through in the market approach is you need to make sure you've got the right peer group. And that means we have to go beyond just grabbing companies in the same SIC codes. We need to make sure that they have characteristics that are similar in terms of risk, profitability, their need for capital, their capital efficiency, and so on, to make sure that we've really got a comparable set of companies to use as benchmarks.
So Vallejo, this is just like your comps in real estate, right?
Very similar in process and thought. It's very similar, but we use a slightly different approach, that we go out and get direct sales of other assets, and we consider whether they have the same highest and best use, whether they're also the same property type, whether it's a warehouse or a showroom or an apartment building. If you're doing apartments, you don't want to use non-apartment rents or non-apartment comps for your analysis. You wouldn't be using, an industrial property or a hotel or something. But we do use comparables, and we make adjustments to those comparables, similar to what Steve does. The methodologies are slightly different, but overall they're pretty much the same.
Steve's job is harder. Look at slide 34, Steve.
At slide 34, well, when we're doing the market approach, again, we're trying to find the right companies, but then we have to take the next step and we have to figure out, well, what are the right valuation ratios? And we have to do adjustments to balance sheets and income statements to make sure that everything is as comparable, or we like to say we have a high degree of comparability in our peer group before we go further in the process for the valuation. So if we can go to 35 now, please. And this is a visual, again, hopefully this isn't too busy, but this is just to help you understand that when we do valuation work, we typically think about this in terms of an accounting presentation, but we use market values. And so We can pick multiples of EBIT or EBITDA, which you may have heard of. We could pick price earnings ratios. We can pick multiples of revenue. Lots of different variations on this approach. And we need to consider the situation that we're in to help determine which of these valuation multiples is appropriate for the job. Next slide, please. And when we take those valuation ratios, we're often applying these to small single business or maybe two business type entities, but it can be applied to conglomerates as well. And this is a presentation of what this might look like if we had a conglomerate with 6 business units. We just break it down.
You got a minus down here for corporate. I don't understand that.
So we've got a breakdown for the 6 different operating units. We'll have to go find their peer groups. Each one will probably have a unique peer group. And then we have to make sure that we account for all the overhead that flows through a loss center at corporate to make sure that we value the enterprise appropriately. So it's called the sum of the parts evaluation, but we have to account for the overhead.
I would like to add something here really quickly, that in real estate, we oftentimes don't do a sum of parts valuation in this particular fashion. However, that's becoming increasingly relevant as you get mixed use properties where you may have ground floor retail and you may have upper floor apartments, or some of these new community design centers where you can have offices and everything in one, or live work units, so on and so forth.
Thank you. All right, next slide. Now, I did a project on home builders last January before all of this negativity came into the market, all this bad news that we had. And I just wanted to share with you some of the issues that I ran into there. So I'm looking at publicly traded home builders for peer companies. And in the top half of this slide, I've got EBITDA multiples for 7 companies that were considered to be peer groups. And you'll notice, after going through the process of determining which characteristics are important and matching those and bringing the peer group together in that sense, we can take a look at the multipliers in the green box, and you can see that the range in those multiples is relatively tight. And that's what we hope for as appraisers. Now, it doesn't always happen this way, but it did in this case. However, if we go to the panel at the bottom of the slide, this is the same group of home builders, but now I'm using a different valuation ratio. Instead of a multiple of EBITDA, I'm looking at a multiple of book value. And I've highlighted one of the outliers, NVR. Now, NVR is different because it does not have a land bank on its book. Home builders operate with land banks that usually allow them to build for a year out into the future, sometimes 2. And that means that their balance sheets are asset heavy. They've got all that land there. NVR does not. So if I'm doing a home building analysis or analysis of a home builder, I need to make this distinction. Because even though I've gone through and created my group, I need to make sure I'm using the right ratios with the right companies. If I've got a company with a land bank, I'm going to exclude NVR. If I've got a company without a land bank, I'm going to only use NVR. That's
so in a cross-examination of the other side's expert, I want to make sure that this is a way, this might show a weakness, where they have somebody I can kick out, I can identify an outlier, and once you change one variable in that little formula evaluation, it could have a big result at the other end. So this is a lot of numbers, not very fun for lawyers for sure, but something that helps show the process that might be involved in that.
Like I said before, Scott, numbers are your friends. You got to get used to that. But in this case, yeah, NVR would have an undue influence because its multiple is roughly 3 times all the other players in there. So it's going to have an undue influence on a price to book approach. Next slide, please. Now, our third approach is the asset-based or the cost approach. And again, this is just looking at the accounting presentation and going through and doing something that we call marking to market. That is looking at each line item on the asset side and the liability side and bringing them up to market values. So we can use that as a basis for our valuation. And we need to make sure that we include assets that are not on the balance sheet, like intangibles, or off balance sheet financing, for example, that would be a liability. And that's how we bring it up to prepare our valuation work. So Vallejo, how do you handle this with real estate?
Well, in real estate, we use, I mean, we've already discussed that we use, different cost manuals, but we're not going off of a balance sheet. properties are carried on the balance sheets of firms based upon their acquisition cost. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with the estimate that would be equivalent to be put into the, if we were marking to market on the balance sheet, we would want to take that up. And if you had fixed assets like real estate, you may hire a real estate appraiser to come in and give you a value that you would enter into Steve's business valuation under that circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great point.
So when you do all of this and you get all these different micro reports and you have all that, what do? You put it on what we all call the friggin' football field?
Yes, we have that for you. So slide 39, please. Yeah, this is our football field. And this is what a triangulation of value looks like. So in the home builder example, I'm actually using just two methods here, using the DCF or the income approach, and then I'm using a market-based approach. Now, the first two values you see there at the top of the football field are DCF based. One of those assumes that interest rates are mean reverting, which again is another issue we're struggling with right now. We have to ask the question when we're valuing something, will interest rates revert to their mean values, or will they stay low forever, essentially, for the foreseeable future? So that's the second version of the DCF model. And then the three that follow are all based on multiples. So this is the market approach. Two are based on price to book multiples. And the third one, the projected EBITDA, is based on a forward multiple of EBITDA. So when I'm doing my work, what I'm trying to do is pull together all these different approaches to see what kind of value I'm getting out of this. And you can see that the second, third, fourth, and fifth approaches give me some convergence. And that's indicated by the red rectangle there. And that gives me some level of confidence that I'm in the right neighborhood and that my valuation is leading me to where I want to go, a reasonable, credible value. However, you'll notice the first approach does not. And that's because it's operating under different assumptions about interest rates. All the other approaches rely on interest rates being low for a very long time.
This is a great closing demonstrative exhibit at trial to show where their stuff is, maybe in a different color, and our stuff is, and then show how we have some convergence on our little red stuff and how their stuff is all over the place. And that's a great way to cross-examination and to show the judge in a single page. I like this a lot.
I do too.
That's because you wrote it. Slide 40.
And so other considerations we have when we're going through it, again, we've got different definitions of value that we need to think about. We may have to change the accounting presentation of our income statement, our balance sheet, to make sure that it reflects what's going on in the market. We also have to think about control shares and non-control shares, and we may have to add discounts for lack of control to the non-control shares. And for privately held assets, we also need to think about a discount for lack of marketability and lack of liquidity. That's a DLOM in our slides, and that's very common for valuing private companies. Other issues we run into are our measures of risk, which are the betas, and we need to relever and unlever those betas. That means we need to adjust for risk as it changes through the marketplace or through capital structures. And we also need to consider recent control transactions when we're doing business valuation. And Vallejo, isn't that much like what you do in real estate? You look for recent transactions to give you guidance in your valuation process?
Well, we do. And again, as we pointed out earlier, that when we have a major shift, the biggest question is whether the data point represents a new normal, or if it's indicating, or if it's just a price discovery data point that may be relatively meaningless, or just something that's in the process of finding out where the new current equilibrium will be. Now, if we go to the next slide, what I want to say is that when we're looking at, when I get a real estate assignment, I look and say, what type of market disruption am I looking at? I've got my baseline scenario, which is item 1. And then there are 9 other categories that shows the effects of diminution, or when a negative event happens. And each one of these categories, we break these into categories because each one of them will follow a relatively similar, although not exact, pattern And we want to evaluate the cost, the risk, and the use in each one of these scenarios. But the thing I'd like to point out here that is in our current situation, there are 5 different areas that we need to consider because of the market that we're in. And this just really complexifies our analysis. We're going to look at the transactions conditions, whether, whether that's in bankruptcy, whether there's a threat of eminent domain, all sorts of things. Then we look at whether there's distress in the market, whether there's terrorism, whether there's public demonstrations, riots, etc. Whether there's legal considerations. And right now there's a lot of legal considerations because the government has gotten involved. We do not know if there's going to be eminent domain claims based upon the fact that everyone had to shut down for 2 months on government orders.
I said that to the press when that first came out. Everyone thought I was crazy, but I think they might. I think they really might. So, Vallejo, take all that stuff and go to slide 42 and tell us the actual things that you look at from that big list. What's important to you?
Okay, first of all, I want to go back into the idea of supply and demand and equilibrium for a second. And when we're looking at what happens to income, you can either have a fall in income, you can have a change in occupancy, utilization, collections, etc. These are the types of, these 6 points that I have highlighted here are the things that I look at and say, what's happening to this property and this asset? And I go through and evaluate each one of these items. And that is really important because it will, this is essentially a roadmap. It's a roadmap for me and it's a roadmap for you when you're looking at your experts and the quality of their work.
It's a cross-examination roadmap. In fact, I'd really like on slide 43, I'd like to hand this to the other side and say, so how do you think about the impact of demand shift? But of course, no judge, no lawyer would ever understand this, okay, 43. But this is the way you think about it.
Right, this is the way we think about it when we say that when we have a one-time shift, that this is a shift in demand. Now, if we go to what we call the cost approach, this is really more of a supply factor. And in our supply, and if we go, we're on slide, this is written
44.
44. While we're discussing both business and real estate here, we have changes in technology. We can have new inputs. We can change our production cost. We can have substitutions of artificial intelligence and robots and automation. And that affects, the automation actually affects not only businesses, but can affect real estate. A lot of the new distribution systems are all fully automated facilities, and we appraise them as fully automated facilities. But all of these are essentially a shift in supply. And if we go to the next graph, you'll see that's the sister graph to the one that Scott got excited about a minute ago.
Don't be using this as your closing demonstrative, because the judge will go, I don't understand this, okay?
Right,
But
all I'm saying is that this is just a shift, and you can see what happens to price and quantity. It's just a simple way of visualizing it. Now let's go to the equilibrium analysis, which is really the market approach. This is where we're assuming that, it's the intersection of the supply and demand, and we see this through closed or closing transactions. And so we don't have to know all the intricacies of what was happening exactly with supply and demand. We're just evaluating the equilibria that occur. But what's going to happen to affect the equilibrium are going to be some of the same types of issues that affected both the supply and demand. It just happens together in this particular set of analysis. If we go to the next chart, this will just show you that you're having both a shift of supply and demand. And when you have that, it becomes really uncertain. It depends on the shape and slopes of these diagrams. Of course, we don't do this and present diagrams like this. We're only doing it with numbers. So it's going to be presented much more simply. But you cannot immediately predict where you're going to show up. You know quantity is going to fall, but you don't know where the prices are going to reestablish themselves.
Slide 48.
Next slide. Essentially, this is just a chart, bringing us back to where we were at the start. Where are we now, and where are we going? We've got bankruptcy filings that are up. We've got the unemployment. You see the correlation between bankruptcy filings and unemployment, and we're way off the chart here. So what's going to happen? We don't know, but we're looking every day at data and trying to figure out where we're going to end up. And we can go back in time and look at what has happened in the past and make some assumptions and perform our analysis. And the important thing to remember is that your analysis has to be credible. It means it has to be well supported, and it has to be validated and verified with responsible, knowledgeable parties in the transaction.
Okay, now hold on. Go to
Yes.
slide 50. Go to slide 50, because we're down to the last couple of minutes.
Right.
This is the heart of the program here. We talk about a lot of things that you think about, but this is like the summary checklist for Steve and Vallejo. Go Vallejo.
And if you remember, this was the first chart we looked at. We're just repeating the same exhibit. What we're worried about is the lack of stability in the macro market. What's happening? And then we have data and we have clues and tracks and things like that we're evaluating. But is it old? And if it's old, does it still fit the pattern of facts that we're looking at today? Or is the data that we're looking unseasoned? And if it is unseasoned, is it the best that we have? And is it showing us the trend? And we have to put our hat on that. And then we come back to, we enter into a period in our reconciliation, one of relative, I don't want to say uncertainty, but we try to re-synthesize the whole process in our heads, or at least I do. And I come back to the definition of market value and say, have I really met the requirements of the definition of market value? And if I have, I feel very confident about my results. And if I haven't, then I'm worried.
Steve, why don't you unmute and give us your closing thoughts before we turn it back over to Bob?
Well, I think Vallejo gave a great summary, and that's what I do in my process as I go through this whole valuation process and I'm doing my triangulation. I'm always stopping at several steps in the process and asking myself, is this reasonable? Does this make sense as I'm putting things together? And frankly, you can have two different appraisers trying to be reasonable at the same time, and they can end up with very different values. So that's where we turn it over to you guys and let you fight about it. But we try to get as close as we can to reasonable. And as Vallejo said, we use the market data, we validate what we're doing, and we go forward with confidence once we've gone through that process carefully.
I would like to just close with 3 words that I want everybody to take away from this. What you need to think of is cost, risk, or cost, changes in cost, changes in use, and changes in risk. Those are your 3, that's the trinity of this analysis.
That's 9 words. Over to you, Bob Aronoff.
I want to thank our speakers for attending. We have 1 minute left. If there's a question that someone can type in into the question and answer, we'll take that question. Otherwise, our speakers will be more than happy to take your emails or phone calls. Again, their contact information is in the materials that you download. And on behalf
And a special, go
ahead, Scott. What?
No, I was going to give a special thanks to Dan, who ran our show and produced us and directed us from behind the scenes. He was very, very valuable. Thank you, Dan.
Okay.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you.
And you cut me off, as I said, on behalf of the Beverly Hills Bar Association. I want to thank you all for your time and preparation and participating in this very informative program. So I think with that, we can conclude the program.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.